Before Inspector Clouseau, before Detective Columbo, before Detective Monk, there was Master Detective Sherlock Holmes. Nobody could pull the wool over Sherlock's eyes. Wikipedia mentions in the Sherlock stories, Holmes is portrayed as being known for his proficiency with observation, deduction, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. With that astonishing skill set, he spotted every discrepancy, every minor slip-up made by people who were bent on deceiving others. And it would seem logical to assume that Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of this fictional master sleuth, would himself be impervious to being scammed by even the most clever criminals and con artists. Doyle was born in 1859 and introduced his first novel starring Sherlock, A Study in Scarlet, in 1887 before he turned 30. It was first published in sections as a serial in the popular monthly Strand magazine, as were many of his novels and Sherlock and Other Stories. Then it was bound in book form and sold to the public as a novel. Doyle went on to write 3 more Sherlockian novels, as well as 56 short stories about him over the years. And that was just the beginning. In addition, he wrote more than 300 fictions, including 24 novels of all genres, including history, fantasy, adventure, science fiction, crimes, drama, war, and more than 1,200 other works, including essays, pamphlets, articles, letters to the press, poems, interviews, plays on every subject such as politics, spiritualism, war, crimes, and so on, including the famous Lost World novel that has been reprinted continuously many times since it debuted in 1912, and which was adapted into a movie in 1925, 1960, 1992, 1998, 2001, and into a 3-year TV series starting in 1999. The last short story about Sherlock appeared in April 1927 issue of The Strand, just 3 years before Doyle's death. After all of his years solving mysteries through the character of Sherlock, you'd think he would have absorbed the methods he provided to Sherlock to use in the real world in his own life. Unfortunately, he didn't. You'd think little Arthur Conan Doyle, shown here at age 4 in 1863, would have eventually developed over a lifetime of 71 years the brilliance in problem solving which he bestowed on Sherlock, and could solve real mysteries in the way his alter ego Sherlock solved them. If so, you'd think wrong. For over 50 years of his life, Arthur was misled and bamboozled by con artistry, charlatans, humbugs, flim-flam men, fakery, and in general, plain old damn foolishness. In this video docu-commentary, we will examine what happened when his powers of discernment were challenged by the silly shenanigans of a couple of schoolgirls, ages 9 and 16. As it turns out, Arthur was no match for these young women in 1917, when he was almost 60 years old and had been chronicling Sherlock's escapades for 30 years. And the aftermath left the great Arthur Conan Doyle's reputation for wisdom sorely tarnished. The girls' names were Frances Griffiths, shown here on the left, who was 9 years old when this saga began, and her cousin Elsie Wright next to her, who was about 16 years old. Frances lived in South Africa, but when World War I began and her father was called up for military service, Frances and her mother temporarily moved just south of the small village of Cottingley in England, about 200 miles north of London, to stay with the Wright family for the duration of the war. The word for stream or brook in British is beck. Cottingley Beck flowed through the little village of Cottingley and down past the Wrights' property. As it passed just south of the family garden, large rock outcroppings created a pretty little waterfall, ending in a permanent small pool at the bottom, with the stream then heading on south into the English countryside. The stream had created a lush, green, tiny valley along its banks right at that point, where the girls loved to spend almost every day among the trees and flowers and other plant life. As the stories about the incident go, the banks of the stream were slick, and Frances regularly got in trouble for sliding into the little brook while playing near its banks and getting her shoes and clothing wet. When quizzed by her mother why she kept going there, she announced that it was because she enjoyed watching fairies frolicking there. As you might expect, her parents made fun of her for this silly excuse, since fairies are just pretend characters. One day in 1917, Elsie borrowed her father's high-quality camera, the kind that took pictures on glass plates. This is the photo of the actual camera now in a museum. And she and Frances went off to the brook. When they returned in the evening and Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, helped Elsie develop the negatives, he was startled to see this photo when it was printed out. The girls insisted it was a photo of Frances with the fairies they'd witnessed frolicking on the banks of the beck. But of course, when Arthur saw the fairies in the photograph, he was unimpressed and took them for what they were, a visual trick the girls had somehow managed. For a later photo shoot, Elsie decided she wanted to pose with a fanciful woodland creature too, and chose a gnome. Both girls insisted the photos were of real fairy folk frolicking with them. But of course, Dad thought it was all childish nonsense. The girls had a few prints made of their photos and passed them out to friends and family. Elsie and Frances's little project would have gone unnoticed by the world and would have soon drifted from their own memory, but for one coincidence. Elsie's mother, Polly Wright, had been recently swept up into the international enthusiasm of that period in time for exploring, discussing, and hopefully experiencing occult, paranormal, and supernatural activity. She was particularly involved in the theosophical movement, including a desire to in some way prove the reality of fairies and gnomes and such creatures. 2 years after the girls created their early version of photoshopped photos, Polly attended a Theosophical Society meeting where this very topic was earnestly discussed. And after the meeting, she shared that her daughter and a cousin had actually taken photographs that appeared to show genuine fairies. Some in the Theosophical Society were impressed and encouraged when they saw prints of the photos. And by early 1920, those photos made their way to the attention of one of the leading theosophists in England, Edward Gardner. That summer, while working on an article for the Strand magazine on the topic of fairies, Arthur Conan Doyle heard about the fairy prints and obtained copies from Gardner. Later that summer, at Doyle's request, Gardner visited the Wright family to investigate the claims. He left more cameras and photographic plates with the girls so they could attempt to get more candid camera photos of the fairies. The girls eventually provided their admirers with 3 more photos. In one, a standing fairy appears to be offering Elsie a small bouquet of tiny flowers. In another of the photos, a flying fairy appears to hover like a hummingbird in front of Frances. And in a third, much less clear picture, a group of fairies with neither of the girls present appear to be sunning themselves in the grass. An author of another website on the topic added a few comments about these last photos. Quote, Elsie's father returned the plates of these final photos to London, wrapped in cotton wool. Arthur Wright was bewildered. He was sure the photographs were faked, in spite of the fact that he and Polly had never found evidence showing the girls had created the illusion. He just could not understand how other grown men had been deceived by such an obvious trick. It was weird that his daughter Elsie was now the center of a nationwide, yes, even an international sensation. Arthur Wright began to have a lower estimation of the Sherlock Holmes author. He found it hard to believe that such an intelligent man could be bamboozled, quote, by our Elsie and her at the bottom of the class. Doyle eventually used the first 2 photos for his Strand article, going into great detail about the circumstances and adding some more photos of Elsie and Frances and Gardner when he visited the Wright family. He gave the pseudonyms Iris and Alice Carpenter to the girls to protect their identity. nor did he identify their exact location to prevent anyone harassing them in person regarding the matter. He included information about the whole incident, much more commentary, and more photos in his 1921 book, The Coming of the Fairies. Yes, in spite of how ridiculously fake the Cottingley photos looked to most modern viewers, Conan Doyle became convinced they were legitimate pictures of real fairies and widely promoted the claims made for them. When someone pointed out what appeared to the average person to be the obvious top of a hat pin sticking out of the stomach of the gnome in the picture with Elsie, Arthur was not dissuaded. He insisted it was a belly button, and that it offered proof of how fairies reproduced. It was difficult in 1917 and even more difficult in 2023 to understand how such a brilliant man could be taken in by such childish, baseless foolishness at age 58. That is, it's difficult until you find out the rest of the story of Arthur Conan Doyle. For you see, his fascination with fairies was only a tiny corner of his interest in such outlandish topics. He had been a total materialist, the type of person who did not believe there is any realm beyond the natural, material world that we perceive with our senses, when he left Edinburgh University as a young man. However, before long, while still in his 20s, he became obsessed by a fascination with claims of the paranormal. He performed experiments in telepathy, investigated hypnosis, attended seances. He was a founding member of the Hampshire Society for Psychical Research, and in 1893, at age 34, he investigated poltergeist activity in Dorset, England. During this time, he became increasingly fascinated by claims of communication with the dead, which is one of the main tenets of the belief system of spiritualism, and became convinced that these claims were valid. For instance, he believed in what was called spirit photography. This phenomenon was started by a man named Stephen Mumler. As Wikipedia describes its beginnings, an American jewelry engraver and amateur photographer, Mumler published in 1862 a photograph he claimed showed him with the spirit of his cousin who had died 12 years earlier. The media sensation that this caused led Mumler to leave engraving and to begin a successful business as a spirit photographic medium, which he set up in New York and Boston, servicing those hoping to find a supernatural collection with relatives killed in the American Civil War. A medium is a person believed by the gullible to have a supernatural ability to mediate between the living and their dead ones. Thus, the medium can call up spirits from the dead to communicate with their bereaved friends and family. One of Mumler's most famous images is a photograph of Mary Todd Lincoln posed with purported spirit of her assassinated husband. The apparent spirits that Mumler had captured were double exposures of previous clients from photographic plates that were improperly cleaned. In 1869, Mumler's fraud was discovered and he was charged. He was acquitted, however, despite the evidence provided that one of his so-called spirits was shown to be still alive. And this, of course, opened the floodgates for charlatan photographers all over the nation to set up business as spirit photographers, since the public was so ignorant of the ease with which double exposures were made. The demand for such photos continued for decades and included, in about 1930, Arthur Conan Doyle. I wasn't able to find who the spirit being in this photo was supposed to be, but it was likely a relative who died young. If you enlarge the image of the so-called spirit, it is clearly the head of a young child turned upside down. To our modern mind and to most sensible people in the 1800s, it was just an artifact of double exposure, with the child having been photographed in a previous photo session, the negative cleaned off except for the child's head, and then that negative used to take a photo of Doyle. But Doyle was not a sensible person when it came to claims of the supernatural. In spite of many articles and books written over the decades since the 1860s exposing the method of trickery used by spirit photographers, Doyle wanted to believe in them, so he did. And there was a lot of nonsense he wanted to believe, including the reality of fairies, so he did. In addition to spirit photography, Doyle developed an extreme obsession with the growing groups around the country, styling themselves spiritualists. A spiritualist was someone who believed that there is a spiritual realm inhabited by the souls of the dead, and certain people, known as mediums, could bridge the gap between the natural and supernatural realms. Such mediums would hold seances, usually with a group of people, where the medium would summon one or more spirits to make their presence known with unusual sounds and movements. The people at the seance would often sit around a table and hold hands or place both hands on the table. They then might be convinced that a visiting spirit lifted or shook the table. The medium would commonly communicate with the spirit via knockings, posing questions that the spirit could answer with one rap for yes or two raps for no, or perhaps patterns of rappings to stand for letters of the alphabet. Just as with the Cottingley Ferry incident, the spiritualism movement that was thriving by the time Arthur Conan Doyle in the 1880s became involved was also started by two young women, the Fox sisters, Maggie and Kate. In 1847, Canadian sisters Maggie and Kate Fox, ages 14 and 10 at the time, and their family bought a small home in Hydesville, New York, near Rochester. The owner of the property claimed that the reason he was selling it was because it had a reputation as being a haunted house, with creepy sounds being heard at times. The Foxes weren't superstitious, so they bought it anyway and didn't notice anything odd. That is, until one night in March 1848, long after the girls went upstairs to bed. Later that night, Mrs. Fox downstairs heard a random bumping sound coming through the floor from upstairs that frightened her. Soon there were bumping sounds downstairs during the day when the family was together. The girls didn't act scared. Instead, they insisted maybe it was a spirit, and maybe it would be fun to figure out a way to communicate with it. Over time, they started asking it questions and explained to their parents that the spirit claimed to be the ghost of a man who had been killed in the house and buried under it years before. No evidence was found to establish this claim, but the word began spreading in the small town that the house was haunted, and people started stopping by to see for themselves and inquire about the details. A website about the sisters described what happened next. Kate and Maggie were sent to nearby Rochester during the excitement. Kate to the house of her much older married sister Leah, and Maggie to the home of her brother David. But the rappings followed them. Amy and Isaac Post, a radical Quaker couple and the long-standing friends of the Fox family, invited the girls into their Rochester home. Immediately convinced of the genuineness of the phenomena, they helped to spread the word among their radical Quaker friends, who became the early core of spiritualists. In this way appeared the association between spiritualism and radical political causes, such as abolition and temperance. They were embraced by radical Quakers. On 14 November 1849, the Fox sisters demonstrated their spiritualist rapping at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester. This was the first demonstration of spiritualism held before a paying public and inaugurated a long history of public events featuring spiritualist mediums in the United States and in other countries. The sisters became famous mediums, and they held seances for hundreds of people. Many of these early seances were entirely frivolous, where sitters sought insight into the state of railway stocks or the issue of love affairs. But later, most became supposed family reunions with dead relatives. Horace Greeley, the prominent publisher and politician, became a kind of protector for them, enabling their movement in higher social circles. Their public seances in New York in 1850 attracted notable people, including James Fenimore Cooper, Horace Greeley, Sojourner Truth, and William Lloyd Garrison. Although Greeley watched over the sisters, the lack of parental supervision was pernicious, as both of the young women, by then only 17 and 13, began to drink wine. The whole organized spiritualist movement grew directly from their activities, and their fame spread around the world. By 40 years later, in 1888, the spiritualist movement itself had become relatively huge, appealing to many highly educated and well-known people, along with lots of just plain old men and women on the street. Thousands of people had jumped on the bandwagon, claiming to be mediums just like the Fox sisters, and manifesting many of the same effects at their seances and other meetings, particularly the spirit rapping, and making money hand over fist doing it. And then in 1888, a startling revelation, which should have, but didn't, shake the faith of all those spiritualists, became public. Maggie submitted a story to the New York World newspaper on October 21st, 1888, confessing that she had been part of a total fraud perpetrated on the gullible. There were no spirit beings involved, just two clever girls who had discovered an unusual skill they had. The first bumps in the night their mother had heard were just the girls pretending to be long asleep, bobbing an apple up and down on a string and making it bump on the floor to play a prank on their mom. And the later rappings and knockings? Those were produced by their unusual skill. They could crack the joints of their big toes to make very loud rapping noises that bounced around the room. They could also make loud sounds with other foot, ankle, and knee joints. But with the long Victorian dresses they wore back then, no one could see what was going on under their petticoats. Maggie explained all of this in her article and concluded with a statement, "Spiritualism is a fraud and a deception. It's a branch of legerdemain, an illusion designed to fool the naive, but it has to be closely studied to gain perfection." She later gave the same testimony live at a big meeting in an auditorium at which she demonstrated her ability on stage to pop her joints loudly. This photo shows Kate and Margaret with their married sister Leah, who was 20 years older than Kate. She later became involved in managing her sisters' careers as mediums and started her own career as a medium also. Here are some of Margaret's explanations of the events surrounding their deception. Leah Underhill, my eldest sister, took Katie and me to Rochester. There it was that we discovered a new way to make the raps. My sister Katie was the first to observe that by swishing her fingers, she could produce certain noises with her knuckles and joints, and that the same effect could be made with the toes. Finding that we could make raps with our feet, first with one foot and then with both, we practiced until we could do this easily when the room was dark. Like most perplexing things when made clear, it's astonishing how easily it is done. The rapping is simply the result of perfect control of the muscles of the leg below the knee, which govern the tendons of the foot and allow the action of the toe and ankle bones that are not commonly known. Such perfect control is only possible when the child is taken at an early age and carefully and continually taught to practice the muscles, which grow stiffer in later years. This, then, is the simple explanation of the whole method of the knocks and raps. She also wrote of the reception of the rapping sounds. A great many people, when they hear the rapping, imagine at once that spirits are touching them. It is very common delusion. Some very wealthy people came to see me some years ago when I lived in 42nd Street, and I did some rappings for them. I made the spirit rap on the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, "I feel the spirit tapping me on the shoulder." Of course, that was pure imagination. So, you might think this confession and expose by Maggie Fox was, as one book about the matter at the time put it in its title, the death knell of spiritualism. The author posts in his book a statement from the Fox sisters authorizing him to share their whole story, which he does. And he states at the beginning of the book that only someone who prefers following illusions rather than the truth can possibly continue in the spiritualist movement after reading the book. He was wrong. Most spiritualists refused to believe that they had freely and honestly recanted. They preferred to accept a conspiracy theory making the spiritualist rounds that insisted that they decided she had been threatened by Christian religious leaders into inventing a false story, and thus all the mediums and their dupes went on their way, enjoying their seances and other paranormal activities. A year later, Maggie recanted her confession when she realized that all of the income she'd relied upon from being a medium dried up and left her poor. But it was too late. She and Kate both had by then become personas non grata in spiritualism circles. Meanwhile, over the years, both sisters had gotten deeper and deeper into alcoholism. Kate died in 1892, Maggie in 1893, both of them close to penniless and dependent on the kindness of a few friends. Which brings us back to Arthur Conan Doyle. By the time of Maggie's confession, he was already a totally convinced believer in spiritualism, and thus when asked if Maggie's confession affected his own faith in the movement, he responded, quote, "Nothing that she could say in that regard would in the least change my opinion, nor would it that of anyone else who had become profoundly convinced there is an occult influence connecting us with an invisible world," unquote. As a sample, here's a snippet of a letter he wrote to one of his sons. His handwriting is atrocious, so I'll read it for you. "Dear old chap, enclosed for you both. You will all be interested to hear that I went to Mrs. Leonard, Mrs. Tanner's medium. She went in trance, and Kingsley," another son who had died, "came through and spoke for 2 hours, showing complete knowledge of all of our affairs. Quote, I notice little Jean has altered her way of wearing her hair. I approve of it," unquote, and so on. Which brings us back to Arthur and the other prankster young women who had a huge effect on many people for no good reason. Looking back at the so-called fairy photos, it's almost painful to think that anyone could have accepted the photos as legitimate. And eventually the truth on this pair of young women ripped to shreds any reason to accept them. It just took longer. As I mentioned, the incident was in 1917. It took until 1977, 60 years later and almost 40 years after the death of the author of the world's greatest detective, before that absolute truth came out. In 1977, a scholar was doing research on children's literature. At one point, he was perusing a book titled Princess Mary's Gift Book. It was a special collection of nicely illustrated children's stories published in 1914, with profits designed to go to programs to help children and women in World War I. And he turned a page, and there they were. There was zero question that these were an illustration of the exact same fairies as in the Cottingley photos. 3 years later, Elsie stepped forward, an elderly woman in her 80s, and confessed that the whole thing had been a hoax. Elsie had taken 3 years of art lessons by 1917 and was excellent at copying the sketchwork of other artists. She closely copied the bodies of the fairies from the Princess Mary book onto cardboard, added some wings, and the girls used high-quality sewing scissors to carefully cut the figures out. The hair and hat style of the Edwardian period of 1917 had women with their hair piled high on their heads, topped with huge hats made of a wide variety of feathers and frills. In order to keep them on their heads, they used long hat pins, sometimes a foot long or more. Several pins would be pushed through the outside of the hat, through the thick hair underneath to make it steady. What this means is that there would be plenty of hat pins around the house. Elsie and Frances took the cutout characters of fairies and the gnome, along with a supply of hat pins, down by the riverside and poked a pin through each character and shoved the pin's point into the ground or into a tree limb to allow the fairies and gnome to stay upright. And no, that little button sticking out of the gnome wasn't a belly button after all. It really was the little round tip of a long hat pin by which he was stuck in the ground. But, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle was long dead by the time of this revelation, so he went to his grave, believing he had seen photos of real fairies. By the way, you'd think that Arthur could have used his powers of deduction and investigation to identify those gift book fairies as the model for Elsie's fairies. The book had stories by famous authors at the time, such as Rudyard Kipling, famous for Jungle Book, and J.M. Barrie, famous for Peter Pan. And right in the middle of the list of stories on the content page was a story by Arthur Conan Doyle himself, beginning on page 23, just pages away from the fairy pictures. If Doyle had noticed the pictures, and if he had the sort of perceptiveness and fabulous memory he attributed to Sherlock Holmes, he might have concluded the Cottingley photographs were fake. But maybe not. Believers are good at seeing what they believe and not seeing things that challenge their beliefs. Fairies and spirit mediums weren't the only thing that made Arthur look foolish. At one point late in life, he became a good friend of the world-renowned magician and escape artist Harry Houdini, and he became convinced that Harry's astonishing tricks, especially his famous escapes from being bound with ropes and chains and handcuffs, weren't tricks at all, but were done through supernatural powers. Harry insisted vociferously to Arthur that no, it was all just clever tricks, including this famous escape trick in this little video clip from long ago. But Arthur refused to believe him, thinking that Harry was just not wanting to reveal to the world his powers. Arthur even wrote a book attempting to prove his theory about Harry. Harry, on the other hand, wrote and spoke extensively, offering proof that spiritualism and other supernatural activities were a total fraud. The disagreement almost ruined their friendship. And just like the fairies, Arthur went to his grave believing Harry was a closeted miracle worker. And Arthur's obsession with the Cottingley fairies and his attempts to spread the news about them far and wide ended up being part of making it impossible for young Elsie and Frances to reveal their little trick at the time. The reality was that the girls never intended to hoax the world with their photos. They were merely pulling a prank on their own families. But they soon found themselves swept along by irrational mania of adults around them, including such famous names as Arthur Conan Doyle. And eventually, it became emotionally impossible for them to extricate themselves from trying to live up to the expectations of those adults. As psychic investigator and paranormal debunker James Randi put it in an article on his website about the Cottingley mania, these two little girls perpetrated their innocent hoax. It was taken up by prominent persons who should have known better and made into a cause célèbre. The children created a monster that eventually devoured them, a monster over which they soon found they had no control. The adults in their lives accepted their claim, promoted it, invested in it, and could not be told it was a lie. A review of the interview of the two elderly ladies had these final comments to offer about the fairy humbug they'd pulled off in 1917. The attitude of Elsie and Frances to the whole question of the fairy photographs is a typical Yorkshire one. To tell a tall story with a deadpan delivery and let those who will believe it do so. Indeed, Elsie had often said, "I would rather we were thought of as solemn-faced comedians." Frances, on the other hand, had always marveled at the fact that anyone could believe them to be genuine. The flying fairy in the third photograph was pinned to the branch behind it. It was drawn freehand by Elsie and seemed to Frances to be out of proportion. The fairy offering flowers to Elsie in the fourth photograph was attached to a branch in a similar way and sports a fashionable hairstyle that has attracted much comment. The second set of photographs was hailed with joy by Gardner, and trapped by their first trick, Elsie and Frances had no choice to remain silent. The consequences that would have resulted from any disclosures must have seemed terrifying to them. An author named Matt Williams, in an article about the Cottingley Fairies debacle, captured the main significance of this situation as it involves Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Thanks to Doyle's endorsement, a whole new segment of the population now accepted this strange fantasy without question. There is no greater fuel for a fiction presented as truth than the credence of celebrity. We'll give the last word in this saga to the famous scientist Carl Sagan. One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back.